Journey back in time to the heart of Central Africa, where the Kingdom of Congo stood as a beacon of power, politics, and prosperity. Discover how this mighty African kingdom leveraged the lucrative copper and ivory trades to build influence, challenge colonial ambitions, and shape the very soul of the continent. This is not just history, it's the untold story of power, people, and precious resources. What if I told you that centuries before colonial ships touched African shores, an empire in Central Africa flourished with wealth, diplomacy, and influence, rivaling some of Europe's greatest powers? This is the story of the Kingdom of Congo, a majestic African power where copper flowed like currency, and ivory was more than just a material. It was a symbol of splendor, spirituality, and political prowess. The Kingdom of Congo wasn't a forgotten relic or an isolated village lost in the rainforest. It was a structured, highly organized society with kings, governors, tax collectors, and military elites, an empire built on the art of trade and the strength of its people. Its capital, Mbanza, Congo, once dazzled Portuguese envoys with stone buildings and royal courts that rivaled those in Lisbon. But what made this kingdom truly unique was its mastery of natural wealth, especially copper and ivory. Why were these resources so critical? Why did copper transcend utility and become a spiritual emblem? How did ivory serve as both an artistic muse and a diplomatic tool? These are the questions we'll unravel in this journey through Congo's golden age. In this video, we'll travel deep into the rainforest trails where copper was mined and shaped into crucifixes, weapons, and currency. We'll follow the long ivory caravans that stretched from Congo's interior to coastal trading posts, where Arab and European merchants waited with open arms and open agendas. You'll witness how the Congo Kingdom turned raw material into power and how trade diplomacy became a weapon sharper than any blade. You'll also meet legendary rulers who negotiated with popes and kings, resisted foreign dominance, and carved their legacy into the heart of African history. From sacred rituals performed in copper-adorned temples to secret ivory deals inked in shadowy ports, this is more than history. It's the untold saga of a nation that defined its destiny, long before colonialism tried to rewrite it. So buckle up, because what you're about to hear might just reshape the way you think about Africa's role in global history, and who gets to write that history in the first place. Long before European ships arrived on Africa's western shores, the Kingdom of Congo was already rising as a central force in the region. Established in the late 14th century, Congo emerged in what is now northern Angola and the Western Democratic Republic of Congo, uniting various Bantu-speaking peoples under one political and cultural banner. The rise of Congo was not accidental. It was built on a deep understanding of geography, leadership, and diplomacy. Its capital, Mbanza, Congo, was strategically located on a plateau, offering protection, visibility, and command over the surrounding valleys. From there, the royal family, known as the Mani Congo, extended their influence through conquest, marriage alliances, and mutual pacts with neighboring clans. With each absorbed region, Congo's vision of a centralized kingdom came closer to reality. Society was tiered and organized. At the top stood the king, beneath him provincial governors known as Mani Congo, Ya Nsundi, local chiefs, and a loyal army trained to protect borders and suppress rebellion. This centralized governance, unusual for many African societies at the time, was key to Congo's ability to consolidate power and control large territories. The system was supported by tribute from provinces, paid in goods like cloth, salt, food, and of course copper and ivory, allowing the king to wield power not just by sword, but by economy and negotiation. The king's legitimacy was both political and spiritual. Religion played a foundational role in unifying the kingdom, Indigenous spiritual beliefs centered on ancestors, nature spirits, and a supreme creator, Nzambi Mpungu. The spiritual class, composed of diviners, priests, and medicine men, maintained rituals and order, linking divine favor to royal power. These beliefs provided ideological glue across diverse ethnic groups, ensuring cohesion through shared spiritual understanding. But Congo's expansion wasn't always peaceful. Wars with rival polities such as the Kingdom of Tio to the east and local factions resisting centralization were frequent. However, Congo's leaders were astute. When they didn't win with military force, they won with diplomacy. Strategic marriages sealed political alliances, hostage exchanges ensured loyalty, and emissaries were sent across provinces to report unrest and maintain balance. Congo's legal system further enhanced its stability. The king presided over a royal court, but justice was also administered at the provincial level. Laws were codified through oral tradition, and decisions were informed by precedent and local customs. This dual legal structure allowed regional autonomy while reinforcing central authority, a sophisticated balance for its time. Mbanza Congo itself became a beacon of civilization, described by later Portuguese observers as a bustling, orderly city with stone buildings and grand avenues. It was a center of governance, culture, and religious life. It hosted markets filled with local goods and foreign items traded from deep within the continent. Artisans worked copper into ornaments and tools, while scribes and oral historians recorded events and genealogy that preserved Congo's identity for generations. Education was informal but widespread among elites. Children of nobility were taught politics, history, and oral tradition, ensuring the next generation was prepared to rule or support the royal court. Apprenticeships in craft, healing, or religious leadership ensured that talent was cultivated across classes. It was this investment in people as much as land and trade that fueled Congo's resilience. Women also held significant influence. Queen mothers and royal sisters often played advisory roles, and in some cases served as regents during transitions of power. Their involvement in court politics and diplomacy gave the kingdom a flexible and nuanced leadership structure, making it even more durable against instability. By the early 15th century, the Kingdom of Congo had become one of the most organized and powerful states in Central Africa. Its reach extended from the Atlantic coast to the interior forests, its influence spreading through cultural diffusion, military strength, and economic ambition. It had carved out a place for itself in a competitive landscape, setting the stage for a new era of international trade and political complexity. Before Congo traded a single tusk or copper ingot with a European merchant, it had already laid the foundations of a sophisticated and sustainable kingdom. Its rise is a story of strategic brilliance, adaptive governance, and visionary leadership, a powerful counter-narrative to the myth that African societies lacked structure or ambition before colonization. In the chapters that follow, we'll see how Congo transformed its raw wealth, especially copper, into symbols of authority, religious icons, and trade currency that connected it to Africa's vast interior and far-flung coasts. Copper, a metal as red as fire and as vital as blood, played a central role in the Kingdom of Congo's rise and resilience. More than just a material for tools or adornment, copper became the foundation of wealth, religion, and diplomacy in the kingdom. It coursed through Congo's economy like veins through a body, linking distant provinces with shared values and mutual interests. Mined primarily in the rich Copperbelt regions, especially the Katanga Plateau in present-day Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia, copper made its way into Congo through a complex web of trade routes. Some of it was acquired directly through political control, over nearby territories. Other supplies came via diplomatic agreements or military dominance over trade corridors. In return, Congo would export cloth, ivory, and foodstuffs, creating a reciprocal system that tied neighboring communities to its economy. One of the most fascinating forms of copper use in Congo was the handa, a cruciform ingot that served as currency. Roughly the size of a small platter and shaped like a symmetrical cross, the handa wasn't just a means of exchange. It was a cultural artifact imbued with deep social meaning. To gift a handa was to seal a bond. To receive one was to be recognized with honor. Handa were used in marriage dowries, political alliances, and funerary rites. Some were even broken into pieces to make offerings or distribute smaller wealth among kin and clients. In spiritual life, copper was considered a conduit for divine energy. High priests used copper objects during rituals, believing that the metal channeled ancestral spirits and divine forces. Altars and sacred spaces were often decorated with copper items. In coronation ceremonies, kings wore copper bracelets and crowns, not merely for display, but to signal their sacred authority and eternal link to both the people and the ancestors. Politically, control of copper was a form of soft power. Provincial leaders competed for access to copper mines and sought the favor of the king by sending regular tribute in copper. In return, the king might grant favors, titles, or military support. This cycle created a steady political rhythm in the kingdom, one tied directly to the availability and movement of copper. Artisans held esteemed positions in society, especially those who worked with copper. These craftspeople were often commissioned by the court to create ceremonial objects, jewelry, and even armor. Their techniques were advanced, involving smelting, hammering, and casting. Artifacts recovered from archaeological sites include finely crafted copper anklets, decorative plates, and ritual tools, many of which were passed down through generations. Trade in copper extended Congo's influence far beyond its borders. Caravans, sometimes hundreds strong, moved copper across the savannas, bartering with distant communities in exchange for salt, dried fish, pottery, and cloth. These caravans were organized, guarded, and sometimes even financed by the royal court. Along these routes, markets would spring up and evolve into semi-permanent trade towns, reinforcing Congo's regional dominance. With the arrival of the Portuguese in the late 15th century, copper took on yet another role: international diplomacy. Portuguese traders were impressed by the volume and quality of copper used within Congo. In return for European goods, like textiles, wine, and firearms, they accepted copper as partial payment, marking the start of a transcontinental trade that would redefine power dynamics in the region. Copper even made its way to European collectors and churches, reappearing as candle holders, crucifixes, and ornamentation. However, with wealth came vulnerability. As European demand for other goods, particularly slaves, increased, copper's central role began to shift. But during Congo's early golden age, copper remained king, the lifeblood of its economic engine and the soul of its spiritual world. In many ways, the story of copper in Congo is a story of dualities, of practical need and sacred meaning, of internal control and external diplomacy, of personal wealth and collective identity. It shaped society from the marketplace to the temple, from the mines of Katanga to the palaces of Mbanza, Congo. As we now turn our attention to Ivory, the other pillar of Congo's prosperity, we'll discover how the kingdom transformed its natural bounty into another potent symbol of power, beauty, and international prestige. Ivory, smooth, gleaming, and rare, was one of the most valuable resources in the Kingdom of Congo. It wasn't just a material, it was a symbol of wealth, power, and artistry. While copper coursed through the economy like blood, ivory was its crown jewel, a resource that transcended borders and captured imaginations. From Central Africa to European palaces, the vast rainforests and savannas of Congo's interior were home to robust elephant populations. These majestic animals were not merely beasts of burden or wild creatures. They were considered sacred embodiments of strength and endurance. Hunting elephants was a dangerous but noble task, typically carried out by highly skilled hunters, often operating under royal sanction. These hunts were sometimes ceremonial, sometimes strategic, but always high stakes. Once an elephant was taken down, its tusks were carefully removed and transported to designated royal storage houses. Tusks varied in size, but the most prized were long and smooth, perfect for carving. In Congo, ivory was not used frivolously. It was a prestige item reserved for royal gifts, spiritual icons, elite trade, and high craftsmanship. Its presence in a household or ceremony signaled power and sacred connection. Ivory's cultural role in Congo was profound. Artisans, often born into carving families, were held in high regard. Working with ivory required spiritual discipline as much as technical skill. Many believed the tusk retained the spirit of the elephant and that improper handling could bring misfortune. These artists created masks for rituals, figures of ancestors, detailed combs, and ornate reliquaries that told stories of the past. Each carving was not just art. It was a vessel of meaning. These objects became a diplomatic language. When European traders and missionaries arrived in the late 15th century, one of the first things that struck them was the exquisite ivory artistry of the Congo. The kings, understanding the symbolic and diplomatic weight of their resources, offered carved ivory gifts to Portuguese envoys. One famous gift, an ivory salt cellar with intricate Christian motifs, still survives in European collections. It was Congo's way of saying, "We are not savages, we are sovereign, cultured, and capable." Trade-wise, ivory was nothing short of liquid gold. Long before the Europeans arrived, Arab traders from the Swahili coast had already been exchanging glass beads, textiles, and tools for Congo ivory. With European arrival, the trade accelerated. Portuguese ships carried tons of ivory back to Lisbon and beyond, where it was crafted into piano keys, crucifixes, knife handles, and luxury decor. The European elite could not get enough. The demand seemed endless. Ivory became a central pillar of Congo's foreign diplomacy. It secured firearms to strengthen the army, textiles for court regalia, and books and wine for the elite. It allowed Congo kings to maintain balance between tradition and modernity, to play both indigenous authority and global participant. But as with many stories of wealth, the ivory trade came at a cost. The growing demand for tusks led to overhunting, which depleted local elephant populations. What began as a sustainable practice steeped in ritual and respect began to shift toward an extractive industry driven by foreign appetite. This ecological impact was coupled with an ethical transformation, as ivory trading networks began to overlap with the rising Atlantic slave trade. As Portuguese and later Dutch, French, and British traders increased their presence, ivory was often exchanged alongside enslaved people. The two trades became intertwined, forming a dark undercurrent in what had once been a proud tradition of diplomacy and art. The same caravans that carried sacred tusks began to carry shackled humans. Ivory funded war, which in turn created captives, who were then sold to feed more war and more ivory hunting. Yet, despite these moral entanglements, the cultural significance of ivory within Congo never disappeared. Even during times of turmoil, ivory carvings continued to play roles in coronations, religious ceremonies, and diplomatic envoys. Ivory represented more than material gain. It symbolized memory, legacy, and the ability to transform nature into meaning. In modern museums around the world, you can still find Congo ivory, sometimes labeled vaguely, sometimes stripped of its cultural roots. But each piece carries the story of the hands that carved it, the kings who gifted it, and the elephants that once roamed freely under the vast Congolese sky. As we move to the next chapter, we'll see how Congo's copper and ivory trade networks connected not just regions but ideologies, religions, and worldviews. The rivers and roads of Congo didn't just move goods, they moved influence, shaping the destiny of a continent. At the heart of the Kingdom of Congo's enduring power was its vast and dynamic trade network, a web of rivers, footpaths, forest trails, and coastal ports that connected its core to the rest of Central Africa and the wider Atlantic world. While copper and ivory stood out as the most lucrative exports, Congo's real strength lay in the intelligence, organization, and adaptability of its trade systems. The Congo River, one of the great arteries of Africa, played a central role, cutting through dense rainforests and connecting far-flung interior communities to the western coast. The river was a natural commercial highway. Barges and dugout canoes, expertly crafted by riverine communities, ferried heavy loads of copper ingots, elephant tusks, palm oil, and agricultural goods. Major settlements grew along its banks, acting as staging grounds and distribution hubs. These towns didn't just sell goods, they collected news, negotiated contracts, and housed tax officials working under the kingdom's central authority. But the water was only part of the story. Overland trade routes were equally essential and often more complex. Foot caravans would travel for weeks, sometimes months, from mining territories and hunting grounds in the interior toward trading centers on the coast. These caravans weren't ragtag bands. They were meticulously organized units led by experienced guides and funded by nobles, merchant families, or even the royal court itself. Porters, often conscripted from local villages, carried everything from copper hondas to ivory tusks, salt blocks to textile bundles. These routes were lined with rest stops, safe houses, and market points. In peacetime, they bustled with activity. In times of conflict or famine, they became lifelines. The logistical sophistication required to keep these routes secure and functional is a testament to Congo's political foresight and administrative depth. On the kingdom's western frontier, the port town of Mapinda stood as Congo's international face. Located near the mouth of the Congo River, it was a bustling entrepot where African, European, and sometimes Arab traders exchanged goods, ideas, and influence. When Portuguese ships began arriving in the late 15th century, Mapinda quickly adapted. Dockmasters, translators, and customs officials were appointed by the king to manage this growing intersection of worlds. Trade with the Portuguese initially centered on copper, ivory, raffia cloth, and agricultural produce, but would eventually expand to include firearms, religious objects, and, tragically, enslaved people. Before the Portuguese arrived, however, Congo already had long-standing trade ties with neighboring African polities, such as the Lunda and Tio kingdoms, and with Swahili Muslim traders who moved inland from East Africa. Goods like beads, iron tools, incense, and exotic spices flowed through these routes, linking the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds in ways that defy simplistic historical borders. What made Congo's trade network extraordinary wasn't just its scale. It was the centralized governance that kept it operational and efficient. The king appointed regional governors to oversee trade zones and ensured that taxes and tolls were collected at checkpoints. Royal officials, sometimes called makotas, managed documentation and arbitrated disputes between traders. Warehouses, known as nkumbi, were maintained by the state to store surplus goods and stabilize prices in times of scarcity. Through this infrastructure, the kingdom exercised economic intelligence, regulating access, influencing market trends, and ensuring trade was not just free, but fair and profitable. And trade was never just about objects. It moved people and ideas. Christian missionaries entered Congo via these routes, introducing new religious teachings and texts. European musical instruments and architectural styles began to appear in elite households. In exchange, Congo exported its political culture, language, art, and diplomatic strategies. Marriage alliances, scholarly exchanges, and cultural diffusion traveled the same paths as ivory tusks and copper hondas. In this way, Congo's trade network became the nervous system of the kingdom, a living, breathing system that transmitted wealth, news, power, and identity across a vast and diverse landscape. It kept the kingdom alive, growing, and engaged in the broader currents of African and global history. The arrival of the Portuguese in the late 15th century marked a dramatic turning point in the history of the Kingdom of Congo. What initially seemed like a promising diplomatic encounter between two powerful worlds quickly evolved into a complex web of opportunity, conflict, transformation, and betrayal, one that would forever reshape Congo's identity, politics, and destiny. When Portuguese explorer Diogo Cao reached the mouth of the Congo River in 1482, he encountered a confident and organized kingdom. Congo leaders welcomed him not as subordinates but as equals, powerful sovereigns meeting for the first time. This encounter would launch a decades-long relationship between the Congo court and the Portuguese crown, marked by exchange, admiration, and eventually exploitation. King Nzinga Nkuwu, ruling at the time of first contact, recognized the strategic possibilities that the Portuguese presence presented. In 1491, he converted to Christianity, adopting the name João I. This conversion was not a surrender but a calculated move to access European firearms, literacy, and diplomatic prestige. Catholic missionaries were welcomed and churches were built. Portuguese advisors were brought into court. Royal sons were educated in Lisbon, and Christianity became integrated, at least symbolically, into the fabric of Congo's royal identity. At first, this alignment brought visible benefits. Congo acquired firearms, which helped the king consolidate power and suppress rebellions. Portuguese traders provided textiles, wine, metal tools, and books in exchange for ivory, copper, and raffia cloth. Congo's elite began to adopt European customs, not out of inferiority, but as a way to strengthen their political image and international standing. The capital, Mbanza, Congo, came to be known by Portuguese as São Salvador, and it became a vibrant center of cross-cultural exchange. But beneath this mutual admiration was a growing tension, one fueled by competing agendas and a widening gap in power. The Portuguese crown sought economic gain and territorial footholds, while many independent Portuguese merchants and settlers were increasingly focused on a more profitable, darker commodity, enslaved humans. Congo, originally reluctant to participate in this trade, found itself drawn into it, sometimes by necessity, sometimes by coercion, and sometimes by internal factional struggles. As demand for slaves exploded in the Americas, Portuguese traders began to sidestep Congo's royal channels, dealing directly with local chiefs and warlords. This undermined central authority and fueled regional conflicts. What started as a trickle of captives turned into a flood. Raids, wars, and social disintegration followed. Some leaders, desperate to maintain power or wealth, willingly participated. Others resisted. The kingdom became divided, with some factions aligned more closely with European interests than with their own monarch. Christianity, once seen as a tool for legitimacy and education, also became a source of tension. Missionaries were often insensitive to indigenous spiritual traditions and local autonomy. They demanded the destruction of traditional shrines, dismissed ancestral worship as heresy, and pushed for a rigid European interpretation of Catholicism. In rural areas, conversion was resisted or selectively adopted. Congo Christianity evolved into a syncretic belief system, one that merged Christian doctrine with African cosmology and rituals. This hybridity both enriched and complicated Congo's religious life. By the mid-16th century, Congo's leaders were grappling with multiple crises. The kingdom's economy was increasingly dependent on slave exports, its social fabric strained by constant warfare and foreign interference. Attempts to limit or regulate the slave trade were met with resistance, not just from Europeans, but from internal actors profiting from the chaos. Yet Congo's rulers were not passive. They protested injustices, sent envoys to Europe, and wrote powerful letters to the Pope and the King of Portugal. One of the most famous, written by King Afonso I in the early 1500s, pleads for an end to the illegal slave trade and criticizes the behavior of Portuguese agents. He emphasized that the kingdom wanted cooperation, not colonization. Still, diplomacy could only do so much. By the late 1600s, the once strong alliance between Congo and Portugal had soured into open hostility. Skirmishes broke out over trade rights and territorial control. The Battle of Mbwila in 1665, where King Antonio V of Congo was killed fighting the Portuguese, symbolized the tragic transformation of what began as a meeting of equals into a violent struggle for sovereignty. The relationship between Congo and Europe became a cautionary tale, one of ambition, cultural exchange, religious collision, and the devastating consequences of imbalance. It was not a simple story of colonization, but of entanglement, of a proud kingdom that dared to engage the world and paid a heavy price for doing so on uneven terms. The Kingdom of Congo's decline wasn't sudden. It was a slow erosion brought on by internal divisions, foreign manipulation, and economic dependency that twisted its once mighty trade network into a trap. After centuries of cultural vibrance and regional influence, the foundation that had supported Congo began to fracture under the weight of external pressure and internal unrest. The symbolic turning point came in 1665 at the Battle of Mbwila. There, King Antonio I led his forces against the Portuguese in a desperate attempt to assert Congo's independence and control over trade routes. The battle ended in catastrophe. Antonio was killed, and his head was sent back to Portugal as a trophy. But the true cost was deeper. With his death, the kingdom lost not just a monarch, but its fragile unity. What followed was a bitter period of civil war. Various royal lineages claimed the throne, each insisting on their right to rule. The kingdom splintered into competing provinces, and the central authority that had once brought order and cohesion was replaced by political chaos. Foreign powers, Portuguese, Dutch, and others, exploited these divisions, backing rival claimants to serve their own strategic interests. By the 18th century, Congo had been pulled into the orbit of the Atlantic slave trade so deeply that it could no longer dictate the terms. Once a regulated participant, the kingdom had become overwhelmed by the scale and brutality of the system. Warlords and local rulers fought not for governance or land, but to capture prisoners of war to sell. Villages were emptied, traditional agriculture and social institutions collapsed. The slave trade, which had once funded kings and diplomacy, now hollowed out the society from the inside. Yet, even amid decline, Congo's cultural and spiritual legacy did not vanish. The Catholic faith, introduced centuries earlier, did not remain a European import. It evolved into a unique Congo Catholic tradition, blending ancestral reverence, sacred healing, and Christian iconography into something wholly original. Religious brotherhoods and indigenous churches kept spiritual life alive, often resisting colonial domination with subversive forms of worship and collective memory. Congo's artistic heritage also endured. Despite warfare and trauma, artisans continued to produce intricate ivory carvings, symbolic textiles, and copper objects that reflected centuries of cultural identity. These artifacts, often taken by missionaries and collectors, now sit in museums around the world, silent witnesses to the kingdom's brilliance and suffering. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Congo Kingdom is its diaspora. The transatlantic slave trade scattered Congo's sons and daughters across the Americas, and they carried their culture, language, and spiritual practices with them. In Brazil, enslaved Congo people formed brotherhoods like the Irmandade de Nossa Senhora do Rosário dos Pretos, preserving their faith and community structure. In Cuba and Haiti, elements of Congo religion merged with Catholicism and Yoruba traditions, forming vibrant spiritual systems like Palo and Vodou. In the United States, echoes of Congo beliefs can be traced in Gula traditions, ring shouts, and African-American spirituals. Even martial traditions survived. Capoeira, the Afro-Brazilian martial art, contains rhythms, rituals, and combat forms believed to have Congo roots. Drumming patterns, spiritual dances, and community structures found in New World Black communities trace their lineage back to the forests and rivers of Congo. What this proves is powerful. Congo was never just a kingdom bound by borders or dynasties. It was a civilization, one that, despite conquest and fragmentation, managed to seed its essence far beyond its original home. Its language, cosmology, and resistance left marks across continents, influencing generations of people who never set foot on African soil but carried Congo in their blood, their stories, and their ceremonies. In the end, Congo deserves to be remembered not for how it fell, but for how it thrived. For the empires it challenged, the art it birthed, the souls it shaped, and the echoes it left behind. So what can we truly learn from the Kingdom of Congo? That Africa was never a continent waiting to be discovered. Long before the first European sails touched its shores, it was already home to civilizations as complex, strategic, and dynamic as any on the planet. The Kingdom of Congo was not a primitive society to be civilized. It was a sovereign state with a vision, structure, and spirit that rivaled the great powers of its age. Congo teaches us that trade is not just about profit. It's about connection, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Copper wasn't just currency. It was belief, power, and identity forged into metal. Ivory wasn't just luxury. It was memory, meaning, and artistry carved with reverence and precision. We've seen a kingdom that engaged the outside world boldly. It sent ambassadors across oceans, educated its nobility in European capitals, and negotiated faith, politics, and identity on its own terms. And even when facing overwhelming pressures and colonial ambition, internal fracture, economic exploitation, it didn't go quietly. Congo's leaders wrote, fought, and prayed. They adapted, they resisted, they endured. Congo's story is not one of simple decline, but of transformation and resilience. Even as its political structures crumbled, its cultural heartbeat never stopped. That pulse traveled through enslaved bodies to new worlds, where Congo's music, religion, language, and resistance took root and flourished. In Brazil's capoeira, in Haiti's Vodou, in the ring shouts of the American South, the spirit of Congo lives. In a world still wrestling with historical amnesia, Congo demands our attention, not as a footnote, but as a foundational chapter in global history. Its narrative invites us to rethink what power looks like, where civilization truly thrived, and how deeply Africa has shaped the world. So if this story moved you, inspired you, or simply made you curious, do something. Like this video, share it, subscribe to the channel, because this is just one of many lost legacies. And together, we're going to bring them back into the light, one forgotten empire at a time.
flows.